Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, this is Book 4 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Chapter 13, Of Wolves and Weddings, Mexico and Russia. The legend, the origin of the sugar skulls. The origin of sugar skulls goes all the way back to the prehistoric times, when the skull was a predominant figure in Mesoamerican societies and cultures in various aspects and depictions. And one of these depictions was a wooden rack in which the skulls of war prisoners or human sacrifices were displayed. These civilizations believed in a spiritual life after death, and so these skulls were an offering to the god of the underworld, who would assure a safe passage into the land he ruled. With the arrival of the Spanish conquerors and their religion, these traditions were lost, and yet a part of them was kept alive by maintaining the figure of the skull in a sweet confection that we can place in our altars as part of our offerings to the deceased. Though traditionally used as an offering during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, using the sugar skulls as wedding decorations is becoming more popular. Every afternoon around 4 p.m., Montoya wandered into his favorite cantina and ordered a beer and a shot of tequila. It wasn't his first drink of the day. No, he'd started in on the bottle just shortly after coffee. But that was at home in his small, dingy apartment. 4 o'clock was the magic hour when he was still sober enough to walk down to the cantina and begin his daily routine of getting absolutely blitzed. Most nights he was also the last to leave. Julian was aware of this routine. When Montoya didn't have his daughters, he spent his evenings at the cantina. Occasionally, one of the night bartenders would cut him off, tell him to go home, at which Montoya would stumble out of the bar and right into one of the other drinking establishments that lined the Avenida. Julian told Juanita that he was driving into town to run some errands, not to expect him home too early. Well, she and Rosa were busy with last-minute wedding preparation and asked him to pick up the sugar skulls from the bakery and more red roses from the florist in town. And that evening, Julian studied Montoya from a table at the back of the cantina. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco smoke, tequila, and the faint aroma of roasted chilies and sizzling meat coming from a nearby street vendor. The walls were adorned with old photographs and yellowed posters of bullfights and mariachi bands, giving the place a sense of history, as if it had been a fixture of the town for generations. Wrought iron lanterns hung from the low ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the room. The bar where Montoya sat was scarred with the nicks and scratches of countless years of use. Behind it, shelves lined with bottles of every shape and size glimmered in the dim light. Rows of tequila, mezcal, rum, along with a few bottles of imported whiskey and gin. The bartender, a grizzled man with thick mustache and eyes that had surely seen more than his fair share of trouble, was deep in conversation with a lovely woman at the end of the bar. Montoya was watching the woman closely, which allowed Julian to go unnoticed. Julian sat back in his chair, drinking a beer, and content with just watching the man. He wasn't quite sure how to approach him and was waiting for just the right opportunity to walk up, sit on the bar stool next to Montoya, and strike up a conversation. Would Montoya remember him from the night he and Juanita met him outside the same cantina? Julian knew that Montoya was a defeated man with a broken heart. The conversation he was about to have with him could go in any direction, and none of them good. Julian downed his beer and he got up from the table. He approached the bar with deliberate steps, his boots echoing softly on the worn wooden floorboards. As he drew closer, Montoya looked up with an expression of bitterness and resentment. But there was no recognition in those eyes. Just a man whose anger at life simmered just below the surface. But Julian noticed something else in those dark eyes. Fear. Julian sat on the bar stool next to Montoya and nodded his head at the bartender to bring the bottle. He poured 2 shots, one for him, one for Montoya. Montoya nodded his head in thanks, and quickly downed the shot in one swallow. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and said under his breath, "I'll have the money tomorrow." A flicker of surprise passed through Julian's eyes. What money, he thought. Has he mistaken me for someone else? He wasn't sure how to respond, so he drained his glass and he poured another. "I told Garcia I'd have the money by the end of the week." "Why are you hounding me?" Montoya asked. Julian figured he'd play along for a bit, at least until he figured out how to bring the subject around to what he was really there for. He raised his glass to Montoya. "Suppose you tell me how you intend to get this money," he said. "That's none of your damn business. I'll have it covered, I told you," Montoya replied, hunched over his glass. "I'm not here to cause you any grief, Montoya. You can think of me as your friend. I only want to see you get back on your feet again, and I'm not who you think I am." Montoya raised an eyebrow and he looked closely at Julian. "Do I know you?" he asked. "You look familiar." "No, you don't know me. But I know you, Montoya, and I know you're better than all this," Julian said in a soft voice. "Well, that's a different tactic," Montoya grumbled. "The last guy threatened to cut off my legs if I didn't give him the money." Well, Julian smiled. "I'm not going to cut off your legs, Montoya. I can help you pay your debts and get you out of this mess you're in, and you can help me get out of mine." Montoya, with this, studied Julian's face very closely, trying to sort out in his mind why this stranger would be offering to help him. What kind of trick was this? His mind was too clouded to think it through clearly. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "Well, why don't you start by telling me how much money you owe?" Julian asked. With that, Montoya got suspicious. If Garcia didn't send this man, then who did? And how much more would he have to pay if he borrowed the money from this stranger? Was it a risk worth taking? He knew that certain mafia gangs paid off the debts of others, but then you were essentially owned by them and expected to either pay off the money at a premium price or do their dirty work. "So what are you offering me?" Montoya asked. "I just told you. I help you pay off your debt and get you back on track, and in turn you help me with the predicament I'm in. It doesn't involve killing anyone or stealing anything. You can think of it as a promise that you will make to keep yourself and your daughters safe." "How do you know about my daughters?" Montoya quickly asked. "I told you. I know all about you, Montoya, and I'm not part of any group or gang. I'm not affiliated with any mafia or any cartel. I have no reason to wish to help you, except for one person who asked me to do this." Well, Montoya's curiosity was piqued. "Who?" he asked. "Who would ask you to help me?" "In time," Julian responded. "I'll tell you everything. But first, I need to know what kind of trouble you are in. Let's talk over dinner." Montoya studied him for a long moment, then got up and motioned for the bartender to bring the bill. "I've got this," Julian said, and pulled out a large bill to cover the 2 tabs. He and Montoya walked out of the cantina together. Now, it's a long 14-hour flight from Helsinki, Finland to Monterrey, Mexico. And Catherine and Usko were understandably nervous about taking the twin toddlers on such a long flight. Flying with small children's never easy, but this flight, across multiple time zones with the prospect of restlessness, potential meltdowns, felt particularly daunting. Catherine glanced over at the twins, who were busy playing with their stuffed toy animals Uncle Miguel had brought them. They were excited, chattering away in the language that only they could understand. Catherine smiled at them, but her heart was heavy with worry. "Are you sure we can handle this?" she asked Usko, who was packing the car for the trip to the airport. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a reassuring smile. "It'll be fine. We've prepared for everything, haven't we? We got snacks, toys, extra clothes, and their favorite blanket." Catherine nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. This would be the twins' first flight, and she worried how they would handle the confined space and the disruption to their routine. Would they sleep? Would they cry? Catherine could only imagine how the other passengers would feel when they found out that they were traveling with two small crying children. And even though they were actually babies, they had grown so quickly that they were more like toddlers. Keeping them in their seats for such an extended period of time would be downright impossible. Catherine glanced over at Usko. "Miguel suggested that we crate them as wolves, but I can't stand the idea of having them in the cargo. What if they decide to switch back into human form? That would be a disaster." Usko was deep in thought. "You know, Catherine, that just might work. Everyone is allowed to carry on, and we could have them right there with us in those little dog carriers. We can give them a mild sedative so they'd sleep most of the way. We would have them right there with us if they woke up and needed attention. I think we should consider this." Catherine agreed that the twins would certainly be easier to take care of on the long flight if they were in their wolf form. And with both the doctor and Miguel traveling with them, there would be 4 adults to make sure everything went smoothly. She decided to ask Dr. Osgood if he thought it would be a good idea, and if it would be safe to give the twins a mild sedative for the flight. She had to laugh to herself. If all parents had the options to fly with their children in pet carriers, disguised as small wolves, what a different experience it would be to travel long. She wandered over to Dr. Osgood's tent where he was packing all his belongings. He had now become a part of the family and would be traveling with them. He was retired, and studying the twins was the highlight of his life. "Dr. Osgood," she asked, "we're thinking it might be easier to fly with the babies in wolf form. Is it possible to give them a really mild sedative to help them sleep through most of the flight?" "You know, I wish you would start calling me Ben. I'm way past being Dr. Osgood to you," he replied, "especially since you call me Grandpa in front of the kids." Catherine laughed. I know, Ben. I'm just in the habit of using your title. I'll try harder to call you by your name," she replied. Good. And as far as traveling with the young wolves, I have to agree with you. It might be easier. I didn't even think of that as an option. A mild sleeping sedative probably wouldn't harm them at all." "Well, good. It's settled then. We're going to go into town today. We'll get 2 carriers and anything else we need for the flight," Catherine replied. "I'll come with you. We can stop by the pharmacy and pick up the sedative." Dr. Osgood put his hand on Catherine's shoulder. "It's going to be just fine, Catherine. Don't you worry." Now, the wedding was just a week away, and Jack and Sasha bought their tickets using their assumed names and new passports. They made sure Grizzly was well stocked with food for the 2 weeks that they'd be gone. Even though Grizzly acted very put out, he agreed to watch the 2 Aussies while Jack and Sasha were gone. Jack was excited to see Catherine and the twins and everyone else who'd be at the wedding. Juanita had planned a party and a photo shoot for the night before at a venue in town. All women were to wear red dresses and men in black silk shirts, and everyone would have a traditional sugar skull mask to wear. Pictures would be taken, and then the bridal party would walk through the streets, encouraging the tourists and the shopkeepers to join their entourage through town to a courtyard where everyone was welcome to partake in the festivities. There would be live music and dancing, tables filled with food, and other tables with beer and tequila. It would kind of be a free-for-all, their own pre-wedding fiesta. Jack and Sasha's flight would arrive just in time to dress and be at the party. Miguel, Kat, Usko, and the twins would be arriving a couple of days earlier, so Miguel could help with last-minute preparations. Jack and Sasha had been working hard to prepare the new house in Alaska for guests. Now, everyone was coming, and rooms had to be prepared to accommodate each couple. There would be a room overlooking the forests and the rivers for Juanita and Jillian, dressed up to look like a romantic bridal suite. A room for Kat and Usko with plenty of toys for the little ones. And a room for the doctor who was traveling with them. They purchased high chairs for Uma and Ulfer and extra dog bowls as well, just in case. It was a warm afternoon in Russia. It was her 4th cup of coffee, and she was jittery. Where was Igor? Nadia had been waiting at this small, discreet coffee shop for hours now. He had said he'd be here at 10, and it was now nearly 2 o'clock. She'd brought a book with her and was able to read the first hour, but when he didn't arrive, she became anxious, and though her eyes skimmed over the pages, she couldn't remember what she'd just read. She checked her phone again, and there were no messages. And just as she stood up to leave, the bell over the door jingled and she saw him walk in. Her breath caught in her throat. He did this to her every time she saw him, just took her breath away. He walked over to her with his long, confident stride and the camera hanging on a strap around his neck and a big smile on his face. "You're late. I've been waiting hours," she said, showing an irritation in her voice. "I'm sorry, little Lashishka," he whispered as he reached down to kiss her on the cheek, calling her by his pet name for her. Lashishka was the word for little fox, and he'd been calling her by that name for years. It was endearing and always softened her heart. He proceeded to tell her that he'd been on assignment and he couldn't get away. "Well, why didn't you message me? I was so worried," she responded. "I wasn't alone. Vitya was with me. I knew you didn't want him knowing where you were," he replied. "Thank you, Igor. And where is he now? Did he follow you?" she asked. "No, he had to go back to headquarters. I made sure no one followed me. Now tell me what is up." Nadia glanced at her empty coffee cup, took a deep breath before speaking. "Igor, I'm leaving. Vitya has given me a new assignment, and I'm torn. I don't know what to do. He is sending me to Alaska to find my mother. She has taken something from the country, a valuable relic that is worth more money than any of us will ever see in our lifetimes. It is a long story. I'll tell you as we walk." She gathered her jacket and they left the coffee shop, heading for Igor's apartment in the city of Moscow. It was not safe for her to go there alone, which is why she had waited for him in the coffee shop. The street he lived on is not where a young woman would be safe walking alone, even someone who was adept at using the small pistol that Nadia carried. It was not that she feared for her life walking down Igor's street alone. She feared being discovered. Pretending to be the 16-year-old scared and vulnerable girlfriend of Igor's is what kept her safe. If anyone knew she was really a highly trained assassin, carrying a lethal pistol and responsible for nearly all the bombings that occurred in this city, the government would have her killed immediately. She worked for the Organization, a secret underground agency of the military that worked independently from the government. Though her targets were high-profile dirty politicians, mafia crime bosses, and other such people that were considered undesirable, in the eyes of the organization, she was nonetheless a target herself. "He thinks I need to leave the country for a while, and who better to convince Sasha to expose the truth of where she is hiding the jewel than her own daughter. There was a team of 12 sent over last spring. Only one came out of that mission alive, but he's missing and presumed dead as well," Nadia explained. They'd reached his apartment and were now walking up multiple flights of stairs to his flat. He unlocked the door and held it open for her. "Igor, I want you to come with me." "But Nadia, you know I'm on assignment. I don't think they'll let me go," Igor replied. "I've already talked with Ivan. He agrees. He knows I need protection and is against me doing this on my own. He thinks that you and I can convince Sasha to hand the jewels over to us, and if something goes wrong, we can cover each other's back." Igor put his arms around her. "You know, I'd protect you with my life, Nadia. If Vitya releases me from my obligations, I will come with you." Nadia smiled and hugged him. Tears were in her eyes. She was sure she could convince Vitya to let Igor go. Both of them had been taken by the organization when they were young, and neither of them had had a day of freedom since. Somehow, this felt like a release. It felt as if they would finally be free from the daily scrutiny of the organization's eyes and ears. She reached up and kissed him. "Supposing Vitya lets me go," Igor continued, "when do we leave?" "Next week. Ivan is making arrangements now," Natya replied. "Sasha has been spotted in Fairbanks, Alaska. We will fly to Fairbanks. We'll start looking for leads. They believe she is staying somewhere near the city with a man by the name of Jack Moore." "Well, that's a common enough name, and Fairbanks is a fairly large city. I hope we'll have more than that to go on," he said. "I'm sure we will," Natya replied. "Ivan is working on that now." Montoya and Julian walked over to their steak dinners. The initial tension between them had softened a bit, replaced by a somber mood. Montoya, who had been tight-lipped and guarded at first, found himself loosening up with each bite, and the steady flow of tequila worked to ease his troubled mind. Once Montoya started talking, he didn't stop. It was as if a dam had burst and all the bitterness, regret, and sadness he'd been holding back came rushing out in a flood of words. He still didn't know why Julian was interested in his story, but he didn't care. Here was a man who listened without judgment, who let him speak without interruption, and once these gates were open, there was no closing them. "I had it all, you know," Montoya said, his fork paused halfway to his mouth, as he looked at Julian across the table. "I was on the verge of something big, power, influence, elected office." Julian nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I had a wife, a nice home. I gave it all up for the wrong woman." Montoya sighed heavily, setting his fork down and reaching for his glass. He took a long drink, as if trying to wash away the bitterness of his own words. "And Juanita, she saw it happening. I thought she loved me. I gave up everything for her, and when she left me, it was like everything came crashing down. I couldn't face the truth, so I turned to the bottle, thinking I could drown my sorrows, my anger, my guilt, but just made everything worse. And then I borrowed money from the wrong people." Julian set his fork down and leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "Montoya, it's not too late to change. You've been carrying this weight and this resentment for too long. It's time to let go, to start over." Montoya laughed bitterly. "Start over? With what? I've lost everything that mattered. My career's in shambles, my reputation's ruined, my wife, my house, everything is gone, and now the woman I love is marrying someone else. And if I don't come up with 30 grand by tomorrow, I'm a dead man." Julian didn't even flinch. "You still have your life, Montoya, and you have a chance to rebuild, to find a new path, to find someone new to love. It might not be easy, but it is possible. And you have to be willing to let go of the past, to accept that Juanita has moved on. She deserves to be happy, and so do you. I've seen what holding on to the past can do to a man. I've seen it destroy people, turn them into something they're not. I don't want that for you, Montoya, and I don't want it for Juanita. I'm asking you, man to man, to let her go. And if you can do that, I'll gladly give you the 30 grand. Montoya sat staring at Julian for a long time. "You're him, aren't you? That's why you're here. You're the man that she's marrying." Julian could see a flush of anger rising in Montoya's face. "Look, I only want what's best for all of us concerned. I want to see an end to the resentment and the anger and the hurt. You deserve to be happy, and so does Juanita, and so do I," Julian stated firmly, wondering if this was now going to escalate into a fight. Montoya sat silent, staring at his plate. After a few quiet moments, he looked up at Julian and replied, "Okay then, give me the money and I'll leave you two alone. I give you my word." Julian took a slow drink and set his glass down. He held the glass sugar skull salt shaker in his hand and squeezed it until it cracked in two. I want you to know that if you go back on your word, you're a dead man. Do you understand? Yes, said Montoya, watching as the salt spilled out onto the table. I understand.